CEO followed his employee after work. What he saw changed everything. The elevator's polished steel doors reflected Marcus Smith's frown as he watched the woman in the faded blue uniform hurry across the marble lobby below. 34 floors down, Elena Morales moved like she was being chased by time itself, her cleaning cart rattling behind her with a sound that somehow carried all the way up to his corner office. The late afternoon sun caught something falling from her worn canvas bag, a flash of white paper that fluttered to the ground like a wounded bird. She stopped, looked back, then glanced at the massive clock above the reception desk. Marcus saw her shoulders tense before she kept walking, leaving whatever it was behind. Interesting, he murmured, though he couldn't say why. From his glass-walled sanctuary, Marcus had observed this ritual hundreds of times without really seeing it. Elena finished her day shift at exactly 5:47 p.m., 7 minutes later than her scheduled end time, always rushing toward doors that seemed to mock her hurry. But today, something about that dropped paper nagged at him like a splinter under the skin. The way she'd hesitated, the almost desperate look backward, it was the first human moment he'd ever witnessed from the woman who'd cleaned his building for 3 years. 3 years of invisibility, broken by a single piece of paper. Elena Morales had worked the day shift at Smith Industries since her son turned 8 and started school. At 34, she carried herself with the careful posture of someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible, her thick black hair always pulled back in a practical bun that never quite contained the rebellious curls at her temples. Her uniform hung loose on her small frame, a blue polyester shield that rendered her nearly invisible to the executives who stepped around her as if she were furniture with a pulse. But invisibility was survival. Elena had perfected the art of efficient cleaning, wiping surfaces with practiced strokes, emptying trash bins without the crinkle of plastic that might interrupt important phone calls, moving through the gleaming corridors like a ghost who left everything better than she found it. She spoke only when spoken to, which was rarely, and her voice carried the soft accent of someone who'd learned English as a labor of love rather than birthright. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Elena's gentle demeanor masked a steel backbone forged by necessity. She worked the day shift at Smith Industries and the night shift at Henderson Manufacturing across town, catching 3 hours of sleep between midnight and 3 a.m. before starting over. Her hands, rough from industrial chemicals and constant work, held her life together with the same methodical care she used to polish their marble floors. In her small apartment across the city, Elena's 8-year-old son Diego waited for her return each evening with the patience of a child who'd learned too young that some things couldn't be rushed. Diego was brilliant. His teacher said so with the kind of amazement reserved for pleasant surprises, but he was also autistic, and his needs didn't fit neatly into the world's expectations. Elena had become his translator, his advocate, his fiercest protector, and it was for him that she endured Richardson's cutting remarks about maintaining standards and the right kind of people representing Smith Industries. The next morning brought the familiar weight of Richardson's presence in Marcus's office. VP of Operations Paul Richardson carried himself like a man who'd never questioned his right to take up space, his tailored suits and practiced smile masking what Elena had long recognized as casual cruelty dressed in corporate speak. "Marcus, we need to address the cleaning situation," Richardson said, settling into the leather chair across from Marcus's desk with the confidence of old money and older prejudices. "I've been getting complaints." Marcus looked up from his quarterly reports, noting how Richardson's jaw tightened when he said situation, as if the word itself required distasteful effort. "What kind of complaints?" "The usual. Standard slipping, unprofessional appearance, that sort of thing." Richardson's fingers drummed against his knee, a nervous tic that appeared whenever he was building towards something he knew was wrong but planned to do anyway. "The woman, what's her name, Elena something. She's becoming a problem." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one had bothered to put out. Marcus found himself thinking of Elena's careful movements, the way she'd never left so much as a streak on his office windows. In 3 years, he couldn't remember a single legitimate complaint about her work. "What specific problems?" Marcus asked, and something in his tone made Richardson's smile falter slightly. "Look, it's not about her work per se. It's about image. Smith Industries is expanding, we're courting international clients, and frankly, we need staff who reflect our values. Professional appearance, proper English, you know what I mean." Richardson leaned forward, conspirator to conspirator. "The board expects a certain standard." Marcus knew exactly what Richardson meant, and the knowledge sat in his stomach like spoiled food. He'd built Smith Industries from a 2-man startup into a multinational corporation by focusing on results rather than appearances, Yet somehow he'd let Richardson's subtle poison seep into the company culture. Now, faced with the logical conclusion of that tolerance, Marcus felt something shift inside him like a fault line under pressure. Has anyone actually complained, or is this your assessment? Richardson's laugh had sharp edges. Marcus, you're too focused on the big picture to notice these details. Trust me on this, she's got to go. I can handle it quietly, of course. No drama. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but Marcus found his attention drifting to the window where he could see Elena moving through the floor below, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. There was something about Richardson's certainty, his casual dismissal of a human being he'd never bothered to know, that made Marcus's chest tighten with an unfamiliar emotion. By the end of the meeting, Richardson had assumed Marcus's silence meant agreement. I'll have HR handle the paperwork, he said, standing to leave. We can have her gone by Friday. After Richardson left, Marcus remained at his window, watching Elena work. She moved with quiet efficiency, straightening chairs that were already straight, checking details that others would miss. Her movements held a rhythm that spoke of pride in work that others dismissed, and for the first time, Marcus wondered what stories lived behind her careful politeness. That afternoon, as Elena gathered her things to leave, Marcus made a decision that surprised him with its spontaneity. Instead of heading to his usual post-work dinner meeting, he found himself walking to his car with no clear plan beyond following the woman he'd watched but never truly seen. Elena's 15-year-old Honda Civic coughed to life in the employee parking garage, its engine sound carrying the distinctive rattle of a car held together by determination and prayer. Marcus kept his distance as she navigated through downtown traffic, his sleek BMW almost comically out of place in the working-class neighborhoods they passed through. The buildings grew shorter and shabbier as they drove east, corporate glass giving way to weathered brick and chain-link fences. This was a part of the city Marcus knew existed but had never experienced, where hope competed daily with entropy and usually lost. Yet Elena navigated these streets with the familiarity of someone who belonged, who'd chosen to make a home in a place that others wrote off. She pulled into the cracked parking lot of the Riverside Community Center, a low building that had probably been considered modern in the 1970s but now wore its age like an old coat, functional but far from fashionable. The sign by the door was hand-painted, faded but proud, everyone welcome. Everyone valued. Marcus parked across the street, feeling like a voyeur but unable to leave. Through the large windows, he watched Elena disappear into the building, and for a moment, he considered driving home. What was he doing here? What did he hope to discover about a woman whose only crime was existing in Richardson's line of sight? But then the lights came on in what appeared to be a classroom, and Marcus saw Elena reappear. Only this wasn't the Elena from Smith Industries. This woman stood straighter, moved with purpose and confidence, her face animated as she arranged chairs in a circle. She'd changed from her work uniform into a simple dress that transformed her from invisible employee to someone who belonged center stage. More people began arriving, families with children, elderly men and women, teenagers who carried themselves with a particular mixture of hope and skepticism that marked those still believing in possibilities. They greeted Elena with genuine warmth, with a kind of respect that couldn't be faked or bought. Children ran to her with a natural magnetism that kids have for adults who truly see them, and she welcomed each one with individual attention that suggested she knew their names, their struggles, their dreams. Marcus found himself leaning forward in his car, trying to understand what he was witnessing. Through the window, he could see Elena at the front of the room, but instead of the quiet deference he was used to, she commanded attention with natural authority. Her hands moved as she spoke, painting pictures in the air, and every face in the room was turned toward her with a kind of focus that indicated she was giving them something they needed. A middle-aged man raised his hand, and Elena nodded encouragingly. Marcus couldn't hear the words, but he could see the man's uncertainty, the way his shoulders hunched as if expecting rejection. Elena's response was immediate and warm, her body language communicating acceptance before she even spoke. Other hands went up around the room, and suddenly Marcus realized what he was seeing. This was a classroom. Elena wasn't just attending some community meeting, she was teaching. The revelation hit Marcus with surprising force. For 3 years, he'd assumed Elena was exactly what she appeared to be, an uneducated cleaning woman grateful for steady work. The possibility that she might be qualified for something more had never occurred to him, and the recognition of his own blindness was like looking in a mirror and seeing a stranger. Through the window, Marcus watched Elena work with individual students, her patience evident in every interaction. She helped an elderly woman sound out words in a worn paperback book, celebrated a teenager's successful sentence structure with genuine joy, and guided a young father through what appeared to be a job application with a kind of careful attention that suggested she understood exactly how much hope hung in the balance. An hour passed without Marcus noticing. The people in that room weren't just students, they were Elena's community, and she was their anchor. The woman who cleaned toilets and emptied trash cans by day was transforming lives by night, offering dignity and possibility to people that society had written off just as casually as Richardson wanted to write her off. As the class began to wind down, Marcus saw Elena approach a young woman who'd been sitting quietly in the back. The student, she couldn't have been more than 20, held a baby while trying to take notes, and the juggling act was clearly overwhelming her. Elena took the baby without being asked, bouncing the child with practiced ease while continuing to help the young mother with her reading exercises. The tenderness in Elena's face as she worked with mother and child made Marcus think of his own mother, who died when he was 12. His mother had been educated, privileged, everything that Elena wasn't, yet something in Elena's gentle strength reminded him of the woman who taught him that success without compassion was just expensive failure. Miguel Venacier, Elena called softly to a boy who was getting re-Smithsless, and Marcus heard her voice clearly for the first time outside the sanitized acoustics of Industries. Her English was perfect, unaccented, and carried the authority of someone comfortable with language as both tool and art. But more than that, her easy switch to Spanish revealed another layer of the person Richardson wanted to erase. Someone who could bridge worlds, who belonged fully to communities that men like Richardson would never understand. The students began packing up their materials, but they didn't rush to leave. Instead, they lingered, sharing stories, asking Elena questions that had nothing to do with reading or writing. She listened to each person with complete attention, offering advice, encouragement, sometimes just the gift of being heard by someone who cared. Marcus watched a pattern emerge. Elena was the center around which this community orbited. Not because she demanded attention, but because she gave it so generously that people naturally gravitated toward her warmth. The respect she commanded here was earned through service, through showing up week after week for people who'd been abandoned by systems that should have supported them. As the last student left, Elena began cleaning up the classroom with the same methodical care she brought to Smith Industries. But here, the work was infused with love rather than mere duty. She straightened each chair as if it mattered, wiped down the whiteboard with the reverence of someone who understood that this space was sacred to the people who depended on it. Marcus was so absorbed in watching Elena that he almost missed the young man who approached her as she finished packing up. The conversation looked serious, the young man's body language suggesting distress. Elena's response was immediate. She set down her bag and gave him her complete attention, her face showing the kind of concern that couldn't be manufactured. Marcus couldn't hear the words, but he could see Elena reach into her purse and pull out what looked like cash. The young man initially refused, shaking his head, but Elena insisted with the gentle firmness of someone who understood that pride was a luxury people in crisis couldn't afford. When the young man finally accepted the money, his relief was visible even from across the street. The exchange lasted only a few minutes, but it revealed everything Marcus needed to know about the woman he'd been prepared to fire. Elena wasn't just teaching literacy, she was holding together a community that the rest of the world had forgotten. She was using her own limited resources to support people who had even less, and she was doing it without fanfare or recognition. As Elena finally left the community center, Marcus remained in his car, processing what he'd witnessed. The woman he'd seen tonight bore no resemblance to Richardson's dismissive descriptions. This was someone with education, with leadership skills, with a depth of character that put Marcus's entire executive team to shame. Yet she spent her days cleaning toilets and enduring Richardson's barely concealed contempt because she needed the steady income that her teaching couldn't provide. The drive home passed in a blur of questions Marcus couldn't answer. How had he missed so completely who Elena really was? What other assumptions was he making about the people who worked for him? And most troubling of all, what kind of leader had he become if Richardson's casual cruelty represented the values of Smith Industries? That night, Marcus lay awake thinking about Elena's transformation from invisible employee to community cornerstone. The contrast was so stark it felt like seeing two different people, except the woman at the community center was clearly the real Elena, confident, educated, respected. The quiet cleaning woman at Smith Industries was a performance, a mask she wore to survive in a world that had decided who she was allowed to be. The next morning brought new weight to Richardson's familiar presence in Marcus's office. The VP arrived early, his usual confidence intact, carrying a manila folder that Marcus somehow knew contained Elena's termination papers. "I've got everything ready," Richardson announced, settling into his chair with the satisfaction of a man checking items off a to-do list. HR has prepared the documentation. We can have her out by lunch. Marcus looked at Richardson with fresh eyes, seeing clearly for the first time the casual cruelty that masqueraded as business efficiency. What exactly are the charges? Charges. Richardson's laugh was sharp. Marcus, this isn't a court. We don't need charges. She's an at-will employee, and we've decided she's not a good fit. Simple as that. The simplicity Richardson found so appealing made Marcus's stomach turn. With a few signatures, they could erase Elena from Smith Industries as if she'd never existed, never contributed, never mattered. The woman who spent her evenings building up a forgotten community would lose her livelihood because she didn't fit Richardson's narrow vision of acceptable humanity. I saw her teaching last night, Marcus said quietly. Richardson's pen stopped moving across the termination papers. What? Elena. I followed her after work. She teaches literacy classes at the Riverside Community Center. Marcus watched Richardson's face carefully, noting the flicker of surprise followed quickly by calculated dismissal. So? That doesn't change anything. If anything, it proves she's overextended, not focused on her real job. Richardson's recovery was smooth, but Marcus caught the moment of uncertainty. Look, I'm sure it's nice that she volunteers or whatever, but we can't run Smith Industries as a charity. The word charity hung between them like an accusation. Marcus thought of Elena's patient work with her students, her quiet dignity in the face of Richardson's disdain, the money she'd given from her own pocket to someone in need. If supporting people who'd been written off by society was charity, then maybe Smith Industries needed more of it. Her work here is excellent, Marcus said. In 3 years, I can't remember a single legitimate complaint about her performance. Richardson's smile tightened. Performance isn't just about technical skills, Marcus. It's about representing our brand, our values. Our clients expect a certain standard when they visit our offices. There it was, the core of Richardson's objection laid bare. Elena's crime wasn't poor performance or unprofessional behavior. Her crime was existing in a space that Richardson believed belonged exclusively to people who looked and sounded like him. She was guilty of being Mexican-American in a building where Richardson preferred his employees to be invisible unless they were acceptably white and middle class. Marcus felt something crystallize inside him, a clarity that came from finally seeing a situation without the comfortable blur of willful ignorance. Elena wasn't the problem, Richardson was. The question was whether Marcus had the courage to act on that recognition. I want to meet with her, Marcus said. Richardson's confidence flickered. Why? The decision is made. The decision is mine to make, Marcus replied, his voice carrying an authority he hadn't used with Richardson in months. Set up a meeting. This afternoon. After Richardson left, Marcus stood at his window looking down at the streets where Elena lived and worked and served her community. For the first time, he understood that leadership wasn't about maintaining comfortable distances from uncomfortable realities. It was about seeing clearly, acting justly, and refusing to let cruelty masquerade as business sense. The meeting Richardson had arranged felt more like an ambush than a conversation. Elena sat in the small HR conference room, her hands folded in her lap, her posture suggesting she knew exactly why she'd been called in. Richardson flanked her on one side, HR Director Janet Morrison on the other, both wearing expressions of professional sympathy that fooled no one. Marcus entered to find Elena studying the termination papers that lay on the table between them like a death sentence. Her face was composed, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she breathed as if controlling her reaction through sheer will. Elena, Marcus said, taking the seat across from her. Thank you for coming. She looked up at him with eyes that held no illusions about her situation. Mr. Smith. Her voice was steady, professional, giving no hint of the passionate teacher he'd observed the night before. Richardson cleared his throat. As we discussed, Marcus, this is really just a formality. The decision has been made based on performance issues and... What performance issues? Marcus interrupted, his gaze never leaving Elena's face. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Elena's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected anyone to question the narrative that had already been constructed around her dismissal. Richardson's composure slipped for just a moment. Well, there have been complaints about. Specific complaints. With dates and documentation. Janet Morrison shifted uncomfortably in her chair. As HR director, she would have been responsible for documenting any legitimate performance issues, and they all knew the file was empty. "Mr. Smith," Elena said quietly, "it's okay. I understand." But Marcus could see that she didn't understand, not really. She believed she was being fired for the reasons people like her were always fired, for being inconvenient, different, expendable. She didn't know about Richardson's campaign against her, didn't understand that her dismissal was the product of prejudice rather than performance. "No," Marcus said firmly. "It's not okay. Richardson, I want to see every complaint that's been filed against Elena in the past 3 years." Richardson's face flushed. "Marcus, I don't think this level of detail is necessary. Every complaint. Documented, dated, specific." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena looked between the 3 executives, clearly confused by the sudden shift in dynamics. She'd come prepared to lose her job with dignity. She hadn't expected anyone to fight for her. Richardson's jaw worked silently for several seconds before he finally spoke. "There may not be formal complaints on file, but..." "Then what are we doing here?" Marcus asked, his voice cutting through Richardson's attempted explanation like a blade. "Elena, your work has been excellent. Your performance reviews reflect that. So why exactly are we terminating an exemplary employee?" Elena's composure finally cracked slightly, confusion and hope warring in her expression. She'd spent 3 years making herself invisible, accepting that she existed at the sufferance of people who saw her as disposable. The possibility that someone might actually value her contribution was almost too fragile to believe. Richardson recovered his footing with practiced ease. "Marcus, this isn't about performance reviews. It's about fit. About representing Smith Industries appropriately." "And how exactly does Elena fail to represent us appropriately?" The question was simple, direct, and impossible for Richardson to answer honestly without revealing the ugly truth that motivated his actions. Elena represented Smith Industries by doing her job with quiet excellence, by treating everyone with respect, by conducting herself with more professionalism than Richardson himself displayed. "It's not any one thing," Richardson said carefully. "It's about the overall impression, the image we want to project." Marcus felt the final pieces of his understanding click into place. This wasn't about Elena at all, it was about Richardson's comfort level with diversity, his need to control who belonged in the spaces he considered his domain. Elena's presence challenged Richardson's narrow vision of what Smith Industries should look like, and rather than examine his own biases, he'd chosen to eliminate the challenge. "Elena," Marcus said, turning his full attention to her. "I understand you teach literacy classes at the Riverside Community Center." Her eyes went wide with surprise and something that looked like fear. In her experience, employers who discovered their employees' outside activities usually used that information as grounds for dismissal. "Yes, sir. In the evenings, after work. It doesn't interfere with my schedule here." "How long have you been teaching?" Elena glanced uncertainly at Richardson before answering. "About 2 years. Since Diego started school and I had more time in the evenings." "And before that?" The question seemed to confuse her. "Before that, sir? What did you do before you started working here?" Elena's hands twisted in her lap. This felt like a trap, though she couldn't understand what kind. "I was a teacher. Elementary school, for 8 years." The admission fell into the room like a stone into still water. Richardson's face went through several expressions: surprise, anger, calculation. Janet Morrison looked genuinely shocked. Elena herself seemed to shrink in her chair, as if revealing her education was somehow an admission of guilt. Marcus felt his chest tighten with recognition of the scope of what they'd done. Elena wasn't just a hard-working employee they were preparing to discard. She was an educated professional who'd been forced into service work by circumstances beyond her control. For 3 years, they'd wasted her skills, ignored her potential, and now Richardson wanted to eliminate her entirely. "What happened to your teaching position?" Marcus asked gently. Elena's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "My mother got sick. Cancer. I took leave to care for her, and by the time she passed, the school district had made budget cuts. My position was eliminated." The room fell silent as the weight of Elena's sacrifice settled over them. She'd given up her career to care for her dying mother, then found herself locked out of the profession she'd trained for through no fault of her own. The cleaning job at Smith Industries wasn't a choice, it was survival. Richardson broke the silence with characteristic insensitivity. That's very sad, of course, but it doesn't change our current situation. We need to focus on what's best for Smith Industries. Marcus turned to look at Richardson with new eyes, seeing clearly the small-minded cruelty that had been masquerading as business acumen. What's best for Smith Industries is keeping talented, dedicated employees. What's best is creating a workplace where everyone is valued for their contributions. Marcus, you're being emotional about this, Richardson said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when he thought Marcus was making a mistake. We can't run a business based on sentiment. The accusation of emotionalism was Richardson's final miscalculation. Marcus had built Smith Industries through careful analysis, strategic thinking, and ruthless efficiency. But he'd also built it on the principle that success came from recognizing and nurturing talent wherever it was found. Richardson's narrow vision was the enemy of everything Marcus had worked to create. You're right, Marcus said quietly. We can't run a business based on sentiment. We need to base it on results, on performance, on the actual contributions people make. He stood up, his decision crystallizing with perfect clarity. Elena, you're not being terminated. In fact, I'd like to discuss how we can better utilize your skills here at Smith Industries. Elena stared at him in disbelief. Sir, you have a degree in education, 8 years of teaching experience, and you're currently running successful literacy programs in your spare time. It seems to me we're wasting your talents by having you clean offices. Richardson's face went pale. Marcus, what are you saying? Marcus ignored him, focusing entirely on Elena. I'd like you to consider heading up our corporate training programs. We've been outsourcing employee development for years, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on consultants who don't understand our culture. You clearly have the skills to develop people, and you understand what it means to work at every level of this organization. The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. Elena's eyes filled with tears she could no longer contain, but her voice remained steady. Mr. Smith, I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, Marcus replied. We can discuss the details later. For now, just know that Smith Industries values your contributions and wants to see you succeed. Richardson couldn't contain himself any longer. Marcus, this is insane. You can't just promote the cleaning lady because you feel sorry for her. The words fell into the room like a slap, revealing finally the contempt that Richardson had been disguising as business judgment. Elena flinched as if she'd been struck, but Marcus felt only cold clarity. Richardson, you're fired. The words were quiet, simple, and absolutely final. Richardson's face went through shock, disbelief, and then anger as he processed what had just happened. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Your employment at Smith Industries is terminated, effective immediately. Janet will handle the paperwork. Richardson stood up slowly, his face mottling with rage. This is about her? You're destroying everything we've built because of some cleaning woman. Marcus stood as well, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd finally found his moral center. This is about the kind of company Smith Industries is going to be. It's about whether we value people for their character and contributions, or whether we dismiss them based on prejudice and ignorance. He paused, letting the words settle. Elena represents the best of what we claim to stand for. You represent everything we need to change. Richardson's composure finally shattered completely. You'll regret this, Marcus. The board won't stand for this kind of bleeding heart nonsense. You're running a business, not a social experiment. I'm running a business built on the principle that everyone deserves dignity and opportunity, Marcus replied. If the board has a problem with that, they can find a new CEO. The confrontation ended with Richardson storming out, his threats echoing in the hallway. Janet Morrison excused herself to handle the necessary paperwork, leaving Marcus and Elena alone in the conference room. Elena sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down her face as she processed what had just happened. Her life had changed completely in the span of 15 minutes, from pending unemployment to a position that could transform not just her circumstances, but her son's future. I don't understand, she whispered. Why would you do this for me? Marcus sat back down, choosing his words carefully. Because I realize that I've been blind to the extraordinary people working right under my nose. Because I built this company on values I'd forgotten to live by. And because someone who spends her evenings teaching others to read deserves better than being dismissed by people who can't see past their own prejudices. Elena wiped her eyes, struggling to regain her composure. Mr. Smith, I need you to know, I'm grateful, more grateful than you can imagine. But I can't accept charity. This isn't charity, Marcus said firmly. This is recognition of talent that's been wasted for 3 years. Elena, I watched you teach last night. I saw how your students responded to you, the respect they showed, the way you handled every situation with grace and authority. That's exactly what our employee development program needs. But I don't know anything about corporate training. You know how to teach people who've been written off by society. You know how to help them believe in themselves again. You understand what it means to struggle and succeed despite obstacles. Marcus leaned forward, his voice filled with conviction. Our employees need someone who understands their challenges, who can help them grow not just professionally but personally. You've been doing that work for years, now you'll just be doing it here. Elena was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what was being offered. My son, she said finally. Diego has special needs. Sometimes I have to leave work for appointments, for emergencies. I can't promise. Elena, Marcus interrupted gently. Part of valuing people is understanding that they have lives outside of work. We'll make whatever accommodations are necessary. Your son comes first, that's not a liability, it's exactly the kind of perspective we need in leadership. The conversation continued for another hour as Marcus outlined his vision for Elena's new role. She would develop training programs that addressed not just technical skills but communication, leadership, and professional development. She would work with employees at every level, helping them identify and pursue advancement opportunities. Most importantly, she would help create a company culture where everyone was valued for their contributions rather than judged by their backgrounds. As they talked, Elena's confidence grew. The passionate teacher Marcus had observed at the community center began to emerge, her ideas flowing freely as she envisioned programs that could transform how Smith Industries approached human development. Her insights were sharp, her understanding of adult learning theory sophisticated, her suggestions practical and innovative. By the end of the meeting, Marcus knew he'd made the right decision. Elena wasn't just qualified for the position, she was perfect for it. Her combination of educational expertise and real-world understanding would bring a perspective that no expensive consultant could provide. The news of Richardson's firing and Elena's promotion spread through Smith Industries with the speed of lightning through copper wire. The reactions were mixed but telling. Senior staff who'd been part of Richardson's inner circle expressed outrage and disbelief, while younger employees and those lower on the corporate hierarchy responded with cautious hope. Marcus spent the rest of the week in meetings, explaining his decision to board members, department heads, and key stakeholders. Some conversations went smoothly, with colleagues who'd never liked Richardson's approach expressing relief that someone had finally acted. Others were more challenging, particularly with board members who worried about the precedent Marcus was setting. You can't just promote someone from janitorial to executive level, board member Patricia Holbrook argued during an emergency meeting. What message does that send about qualifications, about the importance of proper career progression? Marcus had prepared for this objection. The message it sends is that we recognize talent wherever we find it, and that we're committed to developing our people rather than overlooking them. Elena has the qualifications. She's a licensed teacher with 8 years of classroom experience. She's been wasted in her current role. Board Chair David Kim looked thoughtful. Marcus, I understand the impulse toward fairness, but corporate training is specialized work. Teaching children and training adults in a corporate environment are very different skill sets. Are they? Marcus asked. Elena has been running successful adult education programs for 2 years. She understands how to work with diverse populations, how to break down complex concepts, how to motivate people who may have lost confidence in their ability to learn. Those are exactly the skills our employee development program lacks. The debate continued for hours, but Marcus held firm. He'd seen Elena in action, witnessed her natural leadership abilities, observed the respect she commanded from her students. The board could question his decision, but they couldn't argue with results, and Marcus was confident that Elena would deliver results that would silence her critics. Elena's first day in her new office was surreal in ways she was still processing. The space was small but professional, with a window that looked out onto the same streets where she'd grown up. The irony wasn't lost on her. She could literally see the community center where she taught from her executive-level office at Smith Industries. Her first task was developing a comprehensive assessment of the company's current training programs. What she found was both better and worse than she'd expected. Smith Industries invested heavily in technical training and professional development, but the programs were one-size-fits-all approaches that failed to account for different learning styles, cultural backgrounds, or individual career goals. More troubling was what the employee surveys revealed about company culture. While most workers appreciated the opportunities for advancement, many felt invisible, undervalued, or pigeonholed into roles that didn't utilize their full potential. The patterns were clear to Elena in ways they might not have been obvious to someone who hadn't experienced that invisibility firsthand. She spent her first month conducting interviews with employees at every level, from recent college graduates to long-term support staff. The conversations revealed a wealth of untapped talent and unfulfilled potential. There was Maria in accounting who'd been an engineer in Colombia, but couldn't get her credentials recognized in the United States. There was James from the mailroom who'd completed an MBA program through night classes, but couldn't seem to get considered for management positions. There was Patricia from customer service who spoke 4 languages fluently, but was never asked to work with international clients. Elena began developing programs that addressed these gaps, creating pathways for internal advancement that recognized existing skills while building new ones. She designed workshops on professional communication that acknowledged cultural differences rather than demanding conformity to a single standard. She created mentorship programs that paired experienced employees with those seeking to advance, building relationships across departmental lines. The work was challenging in ways Elena had never experienced. Corporate politics were more complex than classroom management, and she had to learn to navigate resistance from managers who preferred the old ways of doing things. But she also discovered that her years of teaching had prepared her well for this environment. She understood how to motivate reluctant learners, how to break down opposition through patience and persistence, how to celebrate small victories while working toward larger goals. Marcus checked in with Elena regularly during her first few months, offering support and resources while being careful not to micromanage. What he saw impressed him beyond his initial expectations. Elena approached her work with the same methodical care she'd brought to cleaning, but with the confidence and authority he'd witnessed at the community center. Her first major success came with a pilot program for customer service representatives.